Welcome to Philosophy 102, Introduction to Logic. My name is Cecilea Moon, and I will be your instructor for this course. This is our final video online lecture on Lesson 10. In this lecture, we'll talk about information from two pieces of text. The first is titled Incomplete Arguments and Rhetorical Language, which was provided to you as external reading. The second is Chapter 3 of your text, A Concise Introduction to Logic by Patrick Hurley. Chapter 3 is about informal fallacies, and we'll focus on sections 3.1, fallacies in general, section 3.2, fallacies of relevance, section 3.3, fallacies of weak induction, section 3.4, fallacies of presumption, ambiguity, and grammatical analogy, and section 3.5, fallacies in ordinary language. The questions that we will be concerned with in this lecture are: what are three things to keep in mind when interpreting arguments? What are fallacies? What are some differences between informal and formal fallacies? What are fallacies of relevance? What are fallacies of weak induction? What are fallacies of presumption? What are fallacies of ambiguity? What are fallacies of grammatical analogy? And what are some things to consider when evaluating and constructing any argument in the real world? Now, in past lectures, we have discussed how we should evaluate various arguments that are not only inductive but also deductive. And we haven't really talked that much about interpreting inductive and deductive arguments. This is basically because most of the examples that we have been working with are pretty straightforward. Not very many of them, until we got to inductive arguments, had any implicit premises that had to be made explicit or use rhetorical language. Now, when we get into informal fallacies especially, it's going to be the case that a lot of informal fallacies that are arguments written in ordinary language will make use of rhetorical language. So what we want to do is make sure that we're able to first reconstruct the arguments that are given so that we can see the premises and the conclusions clearly before we start to evaluate them. Now, when we reconstruct arguments or interpret arguments, regardless of whether or not they are inductive or deductive arguments, there's a few things that we should keep in mind. The first is that some arguments contain implicit premises that should be made explicit when evaluating the argument. An implicit premise is basically a premise that is assumed to be true by the argument that is being given, yet not explicitly stated in the argument itself. It is being used by that argument as an actual premise in support of the conclusion. But the thing is that the author has not made this premise explicit by actually stating it as a premise. So when we evaluate the argument, we want to make sure that we make these implicit premises explicit, because those premises are actually premises that are being relied on by that argument in order to support the conclusion. It's simply that the author did not make these premises explicit. The second thing to keep in mind is that some arguments may be better if interpreted as an inductive argument rather than a deductive argument. And when we decide how to interpret or reconstruct arguments in order to evaluate them, we want to make sure that we apply what is called the principle of charity. The principle of charity is that we should assume the best or give the author of any argument the benefit of doubt, that they know how to reason well. So if we are given an ambiguous argument where you can interpret it either as a deductive or inductive argument, and you're not really sure which way to interpret it, what you want to do is think about which interpretation puts that argument in the best light. If we can interpret that argument as a deductive argument and it maintains its quality of being a good argument, then we should go ahead and interpret that argument as a deductive argument. But if it is actually not that great of an argument as a deductive argument and would be better if we interpret it as an inductive argument, then we should go ahead and interpret that argument as an inductive argument. Let us look at this example that we have here in order to further clarify. In this example, we have the argument, this horse is fast because it is a thoroughbred. Now, this argument actually has an implicit premise, and so what we need to do is make this implicit premise explicit. Furthermore, it's not quite clear to us whether or not this is an inductive or deductive argument. So let's look at it as an inductive argument. Now, if we reconstruct this argument as an inductive argument, it would have as one of its premises the statement, it is a thoroughbred. And the other premise, which is the implicit premise, would be most thoroughbreds are fast. And the conclusion would be this horse is probably fast. Now notice how the implicit premise we provided was such that it turned this argument into an inductive argument. Okay? Now when we look at this argument as an inductive argument, we can see that it is actually a strong argument with all true premises. So it's a cogent argument. Okay? Now let's consider what would happen to this argument if we reconstructed it as a deductive argument. Now when we reconstruct this argument or interpret it as a deductive argument, the first premise would be it is a thoroughbred, and the second premise would be all thoroughbreds are fast. And this is the implicit premise that's given in order to make this a deductive argument. The conclusion then would be this horse must be fast. Now, if we interpreted the example as a deductive argument in such a way, notice that although the argument would be valid, it would have at least one false premise. So this would be an unsound argument. The premise, all thoroughbreds are fast, is most likely false because it's the case that there's probably one thoroughbred that is really not that fast. And of course, this depends on what we mean by fast. But regardless of this, however we define fast, we can most likely find one example which proves this premise to be false. So notice how by interpreting this argument as a deductive argument, we've actually turned this argument into a bad argument. So when we're interpreting arguments or reconstructing them in order to evaluate arguments, what we want to do is interpret them in such a way that we put them in the best light as possible, which is basically the application of the principle of charity. So when we apply the principle of charity in this case that we have here, we would actually interpret this argument as the inductive argument and not the deductive argument. The final thing that we have to consider is that arguments using rhetorical language must be reconstructed so as to make the use of the rhetorical language explicit. Now, arguments may use rhetorical language in various ways, but three important ways that arguments often use rhetorical language is by the use of rhetorical questions, rhetorical conditionals, and rhetorical disjunctions. A rhetorical question is basically a statement in the form of a question. It's not really a question. When someone asks a rhetorical question, they're not really asking you anything. What they're doing is they're making a statement. So consider this example. Now let's say that you are coming home and you are actually really late, and your parents or your partner asks you, do you know what time it is? Now, your parents or your partner is probably not actually asking you whether or not you know what time it is. What they're actually doing is making a statement. And that statement that they're making is that you know it is late. Okay? So the rhetorical question, do you know what time it is actually a statement in the form of a question. And that statement is, you know it is late. Okay? Oftentimes what we can do is we can understand what the statement of a rhetorical question is by considering what it is that the author of that rhetorical question wants to put forth as an assertion. You might also come across rhetorical conditionals. Now, we have previously talked about conditional statements and how in general, conditional statements are not arguments. You have one statement which is constituted by two components, the antecedent and the consequent. And the reasoning in a conditional statement is not the reasoning that occurs in an argument where you have a premise and a conclusion, but more so what you have is the reasoning between the relationship of the antecedent and the consequent. However, there are cases where people use rhetorical conditionals. In this case, the rhetorical conditional is actually a statement that stands in for an entire argument. Okay? And usually when this happens, that rhetorical conditional makes up the first premise of the argument, and then the rest of the premises and the conclusion is left implicit rather than explicitly stated. So here is an example of an argument that is put in the form of a rhetorical conditional. The rhetorical conditional states, if you don't like the laws of this country, then you should move somewhere else. Now, let's say that you were somewhere, with your friends or something like that, and you were complaining about the laws of this country, and someone actually said this to you, okay? Someone said, if you don't like the laws of this country, then you should move somewhere else. This person is most likely not simply making a conditional statement. What they are doing is making an argument. And that argument that they're making is as follows. The first premise is the conditional statement that they actually asserted. If you don't like the laws of this country, then you should move somewhere else. But they are also implying the statement, you don't like the laws of this country. And this is being used as a premise. And the conclusion that they're asserting implicitly is, so you should move somewhere else. So in this case, what you have is a conditional statement that's actually representing an entire argument, where one of the premises and the conclusion is left implicit rather than explicitly stated. When you evaluate arguments such as these, what you want to do is make sure to make the implicit statements explicit. Another example of something like this is when people use rhetorical disjunctions in order to make arguments. A rhetorical disjunction is a disjunctive statement which represents an argument. So consider this example that we have here. The example states, you can accept the laws of this country or you should move somewhere else. Now let's say that again you're hanging out with your friends, complaining about the laws of this country, and someone said to you, you can accept the laws of this country or you should move somewhere else. Now what that person is actually doing is probably not simply making an assertion of a statement. What they're probably doing is asserting an argument. And that argument would be as follows. The first premise would be the disjunction that is stated. You can accept the laws of this country or you should move somewhere else. The second premise, which is implied, would be you don't want to accept the laws of this country. And then the conclusion, which is also applied, is so you should move somewhere else. Now notice how with the rhetorical disjunction, it's going to be the case that the argument is put in the form of a disjunctive syllogism. Whereas with the rhetorical conditional, usually the argument will be put in the form of something like a modus ponens or a modus tollens. So what you want to make sure when you come across rhetorical language is that you are able to clearly understand the meaning behind the rhetorical language and interpret the argument to make the use of the rhetorical language explicit before you evaluate that argument. Now, you should be concerned with these three things when you're evaluating any argument, regardless of whether or not it's a deductive argument, an inductive argument, or a fallacious argument. However, you should be especially concerned with the use of implicit premises or conclusions and the use of rhetorical language when you're evaluating fallacious arguments. And the reason for that is because these things, using implicit language and rhetorical language, actually helps hide the fact that a fallacious argument is fallacious. So be on the lookout for the use of implicit language and rhetorical language, because these things might clue you in on the fact that an argument that has presented to you, although seemingly sound or cogent, are actually fallacious arguments. So what are fallacies or fallacious arguments? Well, fallacy in general is a defect in an argument or an argument with a defect that consists in something other than a false premise. So there's something wrong in the reasoning of this argument. However, note that the reasoning is not necessarily the reasoning involved in the relationship between the premise and the conclusion. We'll discuss this a little bit more in a little bit. Now, there are two subcategories of fallacies, and those are formal fallacies and informal fallacies. A formal fallacy is a logical error in a deductive argument that occurs in the form or structure of an argument, or it's an argument with such a logical error. Now, we've actually discussed formal fallacies in our previous lectures when dealing with deductive arguments. You've been introduced to formal fallacies such as the fallacy of denying the antecedent, and the fallacy of affirming the consequent. You also were exposed exposed to informal fallacies when we dealt with categorical syllogisms, specifically those arguments that committed the fallacies of undistributed middle, the existential fallacy, and so on. Now, these are all formal fallacies, and they're formal fallacies because there's an issue with these arguments in terms of the form of that argument. An informal fallacy is a mistake in reasoning that occurs in ordinary language, including mistakes due to relevance, unwarranted assumption, and ambiguity or diversion. Or it's an argument which has this kind of mistake in it. Now, the mistake in reasoning is sometimes about the content of the premises and not the relation between the premises and the conclusion. So sometimes the mistake in reasoning is not actually a mistake in reasoning from the premise to the conclusion, but it's actually a mistake in reasoning about the truth of a certain premise. So sometimes these fallacies will actually involve considering the truth of premises rather than the reasoning between the premises and the conclusion. However, these are all still regarded as informal fallacies because there's a mistake in reasoning of some sort that has to do with the content of the argument, what the argument is about, rather than the form or the structure of the argument itself. Now, one thing that you want to note is that there are numerous ways that deductive and inductive arguments may be fallacious, and not all of them have names. Those with names have names because they represent typical ways that deductive or inductive arguments involve poor reasoning. So the various fallacies that we'll be discussing throughout this lecture are fallacies that have names because these are typical ways in which people make arguments with poor reasoning. Also, you want to note that fallacious arguments are often used to intentionally manipulate people into accepting that some conclusion is true, especially the informal fallacies. So now let's look at the differences between formal fallacies and informal fallacies. We know that formal fallacies are only deductive arguments, are invalid due to their form or framework, will always have invalid reasoning, and their names are never shared by valid forms of deductive arguments or other invalid fallacious arguments. So the names will indicate whether the argument is a fallacious argument or a valid argument, and it will actually tell us specifically what kind of fallacious argument it will be in terms of the structure of the argument itself or the form of the argument. Now, informal fallacies will be mostly inductive arguments, although there are some that are deductive arguments, and some that can be both inductive or deductive depending on the author's intent. You must also consider the content of the argument in order to evaluate the argument's reasoning or the truth of the premises for informal fallacies. Remember, for formal fallacies, all we had to do was look at the structure or form of the argument, determine whether or not the reasoning was problematic. However, with informal fallacies, you have to think about what the argument is about. The form or the structure will not always tell you whether or not that argument is fallacious or non-fallacious. Also, with informal fallacies, you always have weak reasoning or a false premise if the informal fallacy is an inductive argument. And if the informal fallacy is a deductive argument, then those fallacies will be either invalid or have a false premise. Also, some informal fallacies will share the same name as strong inductive arguments and some will not. So it's the case that the names of informal fallacies may not always indicate whether or not the argument is fallacious. However, some of the names will. Now, what this should tell you is that the category of informal fallacies is very messy compared to the category of formal fallacies. This is just the nature of the beast, and so you're going to have to learn how to deal with them. I've actually provided you with a handout that you can actually use to keep these different types of informal fallacies clear. Now, it's up to you whether or not you want to use the handout. However, you will have to put work in using the handout. So you're going to have to fill in the handout yourself. I will not provide you with an answer sheet for the handout. However, I welcome you to email me your handout once it's completed if you want me to check your answers. And I will go ahead and check your answers and give you comments as to whether or not your answers are correct or incorrect, and perhaps lead you towards the direction of the right answer. However, I will not actually just simply give you the right answer. Now let's consider the differences between formal fallacies and informal fallacies by considering some examples. Here we have two examples of deductive arguments. One is a formal fallacy and the other is actually a valid deductive argument. Our formal fallacy argues if there is fire, then there is oxygen, so there is fire. The two statements that occur above the line are the premises, and the statement that occurs below the line is the conclusion. Now, this argument has invalid reasoning, and it has invalid reasoning because of its form. The form or the framework of this argument is if P, then Q, Q, so P. This form or framework of this argument will guarantee that the argument has poor reasoning. So we can replace the P and the Q with anything we'd like, any content. And regardless of what we replace those P's and Q's with, we will end up with a deductive argument that has invalid reasoning. The name of this formal fallacy is referred to as affirming the consequent, and you've actually been introduced to this kind of argument previously in our past lectures. Now, the other example that we have is a valid deductive argument, and this argument argues if there is fire, then there is oxygen, there is fire, so there is oxygen. Now, this argument actually has valid reasoning. It's going to be the case that if the premises were true, the conclusion would be guaranteed. Whereas with our fallacious argument of affirming the consequent, if the premises were true, the conclusion would not be guaranteed to be true. The form or the framework of our valid deductive argument here is if P then Q, P so Q. Now, this form or framework will give you a valid deductive argument, again, regardless of what the content is. Regardless of what we replace the P's and the Q's with, we can replace it with any kind of statement, you will always have a valid deductive argument. The form of this argument is referred to as the modus ponens. And you've also been introduced to this form or framework in the past in previous lectures when we've discussed deductive arguments. Now, notice how with these arguments, the name of the argument, affirming the consequent and modus ponens, actually tells you not only what the form of that argument is, but they also tell you whether or not that argument will be valid or invalid. Modus ponens will always be valid, and affirming the consequence will always be invalid. Furthermore, no other argument form or type will share the name of these arguments. So any argument that is a modus ponens will always have this exact form, and any argument that is an affirming the consequent will always have this exact form. Also, only arguments that are affirming the consequent will have this exact same form, and only arguments that are modus ponens will also have this exact same form. Let us now look at some examples of informal fallacies. Here we have two examples of inductive arguments. One is an informal fallacy, and the other one is a strong inductive argument. The informal fallacy argues, I know 5 accountants and they are all crazy, so all accountants are crazy. The strong inductive argument argues, every swan that has been seen by people were white, so all swans are white. Now, when you consider these two arguments, it's actually the case that they have the exact same form or structure. Notice how this is very different from the two examples of deductive arguments that we considered in the previous slide. One was a fallacy and the other one was a valid deductive argument, and they each had different forms or frameworks. Here we have one informal fallacy and one strong inductive argument, but they both have the same form or framework. The framework for both of these arguments are: the premise observes something about a sample of a particular group or class, and the conclusion asserts that what has been observed of the sample can be applied to the entire group or class as a whole. Now, we've actually discussed this kind of argument previously in past lectures, especially the one on Lesson 7. These two arguments share the same form or structure, but will have different names based on whether or not it is the fallacious version of the framework or form or the strong version of the framework or form. The strong version is referred to as an inductive generalization, and the weak version is referred to as a hasty generalization. So there are two things that you should take home from this. One is that informal fallacies may have the same form or framework as strong inductive arguments that are not fallacious. The second thing is that you might have two different names that are associated with the same form of inductive arguments, where the difference in the names actually tell you whether or not the argument is a weak argument or a strong argument of that form or framework. Now consider these two examples we have here. Again, one is an informal fallacy and the other one is a strong inductive argument. The informal fallacy argues, last time I bet on 29 red at the blackjack table and I won $200. So if I bet on 29 red at the blackjack table again, I will win $200. The strong inductive argument argues, every time a ball has been dropped, it has fallen toward the ground. So if I drop a ball, then it will probably fall toward the ground. Now, both of these also have the same exact form or framework. Both of these have the form where the premises cites past observations and the conclusion asserts a prediction about the future based on the past observations cited. These are both also referred to as predictive arguments. So there's only one form or framework that is shared by both of these arguments, although one is a fallacious argument and the other one is a strong inductive argument, and both of these also share the same name, a predictive argument. So when we have an informal fallacy that has the form of a predictive argument, we will simply refer to that as a fallacious predictive argument or a weak predictive argument. If we have a predictive argument that is actually a strong inductive argument, we will refer to that argument as a strong predictive argument or a non-fallacious predictive argument. So the take-home from these two examples is that an informal fallacy may sometimes share not only the same form or framework, but also the same name as strong inductive arguments. So once again, in these cases, neither the names nor the form or the framework will tell you whether or not that argument is fallacious or not fallacious. So what you'll have to do is consider the content of that argument, what that argument is about, what the statements, the premises, and the conclusion are actually asserting in order to figure out whether or not those arguments are fallacious or not fallacious. Now, this example here is our last example of an informal fallacy that we'll consider in order to illustrate the difference between formal fallacies and informal fallacies. Now, this here is an example of an informal fallacy, and this argument argues that my doctor told me I should quit smoking, but she smokes too. So smoking can't be that bad for you. Now, the form or the framework of this fallacy is the premises cites the hypocrisy of a person, and the conclusion asserts that we ought to reject the argument given by the person who is cited in the premises as being hypocritical. Now, this argument will always be a weak argument, and it's weak because of the form or structure of this argument. The name of this form or structure specifically is referred to as a tu quoque, and a tu quoque is a type of argument against the person. So a tu quoque will always be an argument which in the premises cites the hypocrisy of a person, and in the conclusion asserts that we ought to reject the argument given by the person who is cited in the premises as being hypocritical. Furthermore, a tu quoque will always be a weak argument. So there are no examples of a strong inductive argument or a strong deductive argument of this kind. So in this case, you have an informal fallacy where the name of the argument itself will tell you that it is actually an argument with weak reasoning. So it is fallacious, and it will tell you exactly what the form of this argument is. So the lesson that you should take home from this example is that although the names and frameworks or forms of informal fallacies may not always tell you whether or not the argument you have is in fact a fallacious argument or a non-fallacious argument, it will be the case that sometimes the names and the form of the informal fallacy will actually tell you that you have a fallacious argument with weak reasoning. So once again, these examples in the past 3 slides that we've discussed are supposed to illustrate to you the complexity of the category of informal fallacies. Unlike formal fallacies, the categories of informal fallacies are not neat. They don't squarely belong to certain categories and not to others, and so on and so forth. Now, this may add some frustration when it comes to thinking about or understanding informal fallacies. And unfortunately, this is simply the nature of the beast. The best way to deal with these informal fallacies in order to lessen your frustration is simply practice, identifying and applying the concepts. Furthermore, I highly recommend that you use the handout which I have provided for you in order to organize the categories that are given to you as informal fallacies. Now, for the rest of this lecture, we're going to focus on specific informal fallacies and work on understanding how these fallacies work and how they are structured. However, before we do so, I want to briefly discuss the major subcategories of informal fallacies. Now, one thing that you should note is that the subcategories of informal fallacies that are introduced in your book, which are here listed as follows: the fallacies of relevance, the fallacies of weak induction, fallacies of presumption, fallacies of ambiguity, and fallacies of grammatical analogies. These subcategories are actually not standard subcategories. The reason for this is because the way that informal fallacies are organized into subcategories of informal fallacies is relative to the textbook that you're using. So some textbooks will organize informal fallacies in different ways, and other textbooks will organize informal fallacies in other ways. So depending on the textbook you're using, the subcategories that are associated with specific informal fallacies may differ. However, these informal fallacies, the specific types that will be discussed, are generally standardized so that regardless of the subcategories in which they have been placed into by various textbooks, the way in which these informal fallacies will work and how they are structured will be generally the same regardless of the textbook that's being used. So the best thing to do is kind of understand why these authors might categorize specific informal fallacies in the way that they have, but focus on the specific types of informal fallacies and their structure and reasoning, rather than worrying about the subcategories in which these specific informal fallacies are placed. Your book introduces 5 subcategories for informal fallacies. The first of these is the fallacies of relevance. A fallacy of relevance is a weak inductive argument in which premises are irrelevant to the truth of the conclusion. So fallacies of relevance will always be inductive arguments, and they will always have premises that are irrelevant to the truth of the conclusion. Furthermore, because the premises are irrelevant to the truth of the conclusion, a fallacy of relevance will have premises which fail to support the truth of the conclusion. So, fallacies of relevance will also always have weak inductive reasoning. The next subcategory is the fallacies of weak induction. Fallacies of weak induction are weak inductive arguments in which the premises are relevant to the conclusion but fail to provide sufficient support for the truth of the conclusion. So fallacies of weak induction, like fallacies of relevance, will also always be inductive arguments. Furthermore, fallacies of weak induction, unlike fallacies of relevance, will have premises that are actually relevant to the truth of the conclusion. However, because these relevant premises fail to provide enough support to believe that the conclusion will be probably true, all fallacies of weak induction will also have weak inductive reasoning, just like fallacies of relevance. The third subcategory of informal fallacies is the fallacies of presumption. Fallacies of presumption are typically deductive arguments that are invalid or have at least one false premise, and they rely on unwarranted assumptions to create the illusion of a valid argument. So, fallacies of presumption will typically be deductive arguments, and the key to fallacies of presumption is that they rely on some assumption which the author is not warranted in holding. Furthermore, the author will typically hold this unwarranted assumption intentionally in order to manipulate the audience or the listener into believing that the argument provided is a good or valid argument. Because fallacies of presumption rely on assumptions which the author was not warranted in holding, it will be the case that these fallacies will either have invalid reasoning or at least one false premise. Fallacies of ambiguity is our fourth category of informal fallacies. Fallacies of ambiguity are weak inductive or deductive arguments that rely on ambiguities in the meaning of a term or sentence in order to create the illusion of a strong or valid argument. So, fallacies of ambiguity may be deductive or inductive arguments. Furthermore, all fallacies of ambiguity will rely on the fact that a certain word has 2 or more meanings, or a certain sentence, because of its ambiguous structure, has 2 or more meanings. And relying on these ambiguities of the term or the sentence is intended to create the illusion that you have a strong or valid argument. However, sometimes it will be the case that an author presents a fallacy of ambiguity unknowingly. Our final subcategory of informal fallacies presented by your book is the fallacies of grammatical analogy. Fallacies of grammatical analogy are weak inductive or invalid deductive arguments that rely on having grammatical structures that are analogous to strong or valid argument. Now, your book presents two specific types of fallacies of grammatical analogies, the fallacy of composition and the fallacy of division. These two types of fallacious arguments are categorized according to your text as fallacies of grammatical analogies because they share the same grammatical structure as non-fallacious arguments. However, I would categorize these two fallacies as fallacies of presumption. And the reason for this is because the fallacy of composition as well as the fallacy of division both make assumptions in which the author of the arguments are not warranted in making. We will discuss what these two specific assumptions are when we discuss fallacies of composition and fallacies of division in more detail later on in the lecture. For now, what I want you to understand is this. These 5 subcategories of informal fallacies may be helpful for you in order to categorize the various types of informal fallacies that you will be introduced to. However, if you find some of these subcategories confusing in the sense that you don't understand why certain types of informal fallacies are placed under one subcategory rather than the other, that's perfectly fine. Again, as I explained in the beginning, subcategories of informal fallacies are not standardized. So these subcategories are actually relative to a specific text that you're using and the author of that text. So don't worry too much about the subcategories of informal fallacies. What I want you to do is focus on the actual various types of informal fallacies.